Our second panel this afternoon focuses on the impact that new technology and social media have upon free speech. We welcome our moderator, Jim Crutchfield, President of the Board for Public Source, Pittsburgh's nonprofit public service journalism site. A Pittsburgh native and Duquesne alum, Mr. Crutchfield led an accomplished career as a newspaper reporter, editor, publisher, and president, spanning 3 decades in 5 cities, and held professorships at Arizona State University and here at Duquesne. Joining us for our panel discussion are Sri Srinivasan, Diana Burley, and Jason Willick. And would you all please come to the stage? Sri Srinivasan is former professor and associate dean of Columbia Journalism School. He served as chief digital officer for the City of New York, Columbia University, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This year, he co-founded Digimentors, a digital consultancy whose clients include the Pulitzer Prizes and the UN Refugee Agency. Diana Burley is executive director and chair of the Institute for Information Infrastructure Protection and professor of human and organizational learning at George Washington University. This year, she co-chaired the joint task force that published the first set of global cybersecurity curricula guidelines. Jason Willick reports and comments on politics and social issues for the Wall Street Journal, where he's assistant editorial features editor for the opinion section. He has also written for the Washington Post, New York Magazine, and the National Review.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm a rule breaker. I want to first add my thanks to Duquesne and the Pittsburgh Foundation for this conference, and to thank all of you for being here for this important conference. Now, befitting our subject, we want to have a freewheeling, provocative panel discussion. The panelists may jump in at any point, particularly when they disagree with something. And as for you out there, the rule will be similar. There's a microphone in the audience, and if you want to say something during the discussion, stand up, and I may call on you. Someone will get a mic to you. With that, let me begin the questioning with Jason. Jason, you've written on the subject of this panel, asking whether social media is a savior of democracy or its nemesis. The essence of the American free speech ideal is competition in the marketplace of ideas. With so much bad meat and spoiled produce in the marketplace that's expanded exponentially, have new technology and social media overwhelmed us?
Well, I think it's important to appreciate the way that views on this have changed dramatically in the last decade. Many of us remember the Arab Spring, 2011, 2010. Some people called it the Twitter revolution, and there was a hope that new technologies and social media would democratize the flow of information in authoritarian regimes all over the world and would make it impossible for them to control what their population said or heard, and that this was sort of a unstoppable engine for democracy. And just 7 years after that very rosy and possibly naive outlook that prompted many books and think pieces, we're now saying maybe the free flow of information and the democratic flow of information isn't going to spread democracy abroad, but it's going to destroy democracy at home. So there's definitely been a growing pessimism about that, and I think that's warranted to some extent. I think that the idea that the free flow of information through these platforms was necessarily going to be a machine for liberation and free speech was always wrong, and we're going to need to be careful to make norms around social media so that it can stay compatible with democracy.
Traditionally, organizations have been gatekeepers for information. Is that
Yeah,
gone?
I mean, I think, 50 or 60 years ago, cable TV, there was just a few, well, that started in the 90s, but broadcast media was controlled by only a few big outlets, and so a few people, New York media executives had a lot of control over what information people could get, and if you wanted to access information outside of the mainstream, you might need to go to a bookstore or read sort of a small circulation magazine, but there was sort of centralized control by certain media gatekeepers over what the Overton window was in terms of political ideas and information. And in social media, that sort of blew up that Overton window. Everyone could say what they wanted. There was not, at least initially, a centralized gatekeeper. You could access radical information on the left or the right much more easily by looking at Twitter or Facebook accounts that promote those ideas. And I think now what's happening is social media companies are realizing, wait, without gatekeepers, there's a lot of hate speech and there's a lot of fake news, and all of a sudden they find themselves performing a job that they didn't sign up for, or they didn't think they were signing up for, when they said, we have to be the new gatekeepers. We have to play the role that big media companies did several decades ago, and we have to set the boundaries. But it's not going very well, and I think that they're executing it fairly clumsily.
We'll have to get to the question of whether not only was it not what they set out to do, it's not what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets in the way of the business model, right?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of Twitter and Facebook is people are posting content for free. They're just a platform for people to create content which they can then make money off of. So regulating that content is bad for business if you're going to start policing what kind of content people can create. So it's a mess, and they have to, and as a society, we have to figure out how we can make this work again.
As Jason mentioned, we all worry about fake news, whether we're talking about Russians, Macedonians, Alex Jones's InfoWars, or President Trump talking about what he doesn't want to hear. But Diana, you worry about fake news from another perspective, cybersecurity.
Right.
What's the connection between fake news and cybercrime?
Well, I think that we have to remember what cybersecurity is about at its core is three things: confidentiality, which is privacy; integrity, which is whether we're talking about accuracy; and availability, when people can get the information that they want to get. And so when we talk about the spread of information on social media, it's not just extreme views that we need to think about, but it's also the spread of misinformation or disinformation, because that spread of information can cause us to question the integrity of the data, of the information that we see, not just because it spreads so rapidly, but also because increasingly we have applications that are based off of crowdsourced information, not from a single source, but from a variety of sources, from everyone in this audience. And so if that data, if that app, if the result that you're getting is based off of crowdsourced information, and everyone in this room has provided information that is based off of false or erroneous information, then all of a sudden we have a result that is inaccurate, but we don't have a way of controlling that. And so we have to think very critically about how do we balance the rights of individuals to communicate as they have the right to do, but also recognizing that the way that technology is advancing, it is fundamentally shaped by that information, and that causes us to question the security of the technology and the results and such that we are getting and then acting upon.
I think we have a question right here.
So far, everyone's talked about controlling. Who is it to make the decision as to what is to be controlled? I mean, you're talking about accuracy, yes, but who is the ultimate arbiter of accuracy? Should it not be the individual themselves? Are you going back to the old patriotic type of society where we had the government or some other authority, such as the church or some organization, being the arbiter of reliability?
I think the answer in part is the question of the Telecom Act. Does anyone want to take a shot at answering the question here?
Well, let me address accuracy, or let me at least divide information or fact into two different places, because I think that your question is based on a subjectivity and a question about who can make a subjective view of accuracy, but there are also just ground facts. And I'll give you a case. There was a case last winter in New York that was about a flower shop that people on social media decided that they, for whatever reason, that the flower shop on Valentine's Day, they said this shop is closed, okay? And while it may have started with malicious intent, it spread very rapidly on social media, and the crowdsourced information that then spread ultimately led Google Maps and other information sources to say that this store was closed. And that had implications for their business. And that wasn't a question of who got to arbitrate whether or not there was truth. It was simply facts versus non-facts. And so I think that even when we get to that question, we have to separate the kind of information and the kind of fact or arbitration of veracity that we're talking about.
I would just say that the way that we're determining veracity now, Facebook has hired something like 10,000 editors that it says are going to determine veracity. So all the social media companies, their executives are sort of making these judgments about what's hate speech and what's fake news. And many people who are more libertarian leaning would say that that's a bad recipe. That's a recipe for disaster. And I'm inclined to agree that these sort of moderators might make the wrong decisions, but that's sort of where we are, where the companies feel that they have to be going.
Sri, it's probably an appropriate point to ask you, what are the lessons from the last 2 years that will help us understand the future of free speech? And then I have a second part to that question.
Sure. I'd first like to thank Duquesne University for having us here. And as someone who was born in a Catholic hospital in Tokyo and went to Catholic schools in 3 continents, I really appreciate great Catholic education. So thank you for having me here. I should also tell you that I'm wearing my Colin Kaepernick shoes in support of Colin and his right to speak out. And I also learned by watching on Twitter what happens when Mary Bono, the brand new interim head of the USA Gymnastics, took a similar pair of shoes and tried to black out the swoosh on the Nike shoe, and she lost her job within 4 days. And so I think what we've learned in the last 2 years, is very important. Lots of different things we've learned, and one of them is that it's interesting to see where you live and what you learn. As an immigrant myself to this wonderful country, we have protections here that most places don't. And I don't think we appreciate it as much. Here we are celebrating this, so everybody in this room appreciates it. But I don't think everyday Americans appreciate what we have with the various freedoms. And so I think that's something for us to think about. And what we have seen is that the way social media has evolved has resulted in something that we hadn't expected. If the social media companies themselves don't understand social media, the result is that we have things that we shouldn't be having. So we have the fake news, we have Russian trolls, and because of these things, we also have the presidency of Donald J. Trump, a direct result of him understanding social media better than the social media companies. And the first two things, the trolls and the fake news, would have always been there, but they are now able to power what we've seen in the rise of the political figures, not just in the United States, but in so many other countries. The other thing that we've noticed is that whereas here we're having a kind of academic debate about democracy and its future, in other countries, what's happening on social media and the ability for people to use it any way they want is resulting in people dying. In places like Myanmar, where the Rohingya crisis was made so much worse and fueled by what happened on Facebook, or in Sri Lanka, or in India, where a WhatsApp message can result in people dying almost in a few minutes, where a mob comes and kills you, is something that we don't understand here. And that's where the discussions of who's allowed to police something, which does the government step in, do the social media companies. The fact is these companies did not understand what they were doing and didn't listen as folks in Sri Lanka cried for help and said, please do something, Facebook, do something, Twitter, about what's happening on the ground. And these companies didn't know how to do it because they didn't have the tools, didn't have the language experts, et cetera. Myanmar, they're now hired folks who speak the Burmese language, for example, Facebook has. But it's a small step in what they need to do in terms of the entire world is watching and is being twisted around by what we see on social. But having said that, I'm a big fan of social media, and I believe overall it has done more good than harm, and I remain optimistic about its potential.
What do people get wrong about social media and free speech?
Well, what they get wrong is that we are going to see so much more change in the next few years. We have lived through, in the last 10 years, an incredible amount of change in social media and its effect on all our lives. But we're about to see even more and a faster velocity, and it's going to cause even more turmoil, despite the best efforts of all of us being hyper aware of the dangers. So that's what we're getting wrong, and we all need to think about what we can do.
How else, and this is for any of you, how else are social media both good and bad for free speech?
Well, it's good in the obvious way that everyone can find an audience more quickly than they could before. That was the promise of Twitter and the promise of Facebook. It used to be the technological barriers to a printing press and getting your ideas out on a mass scale used to be much higher than they are of just making a Twitter account and getting a following. It's bad, though, in that it can make people really polarized, and it can make people hate each other and then start demanding that the companies police speech and don't allow speech by certain people. And so insofar as it creates more polarization, polarization is bad for free speech and will end up leading to calls to undermine it.
So I'm going to say, and this is not necessarily specifically about cybersecurity, but just in general, when we talk about technology, I fundamentally disagree with the idea that technology is somehow separate from people or from human nature. Social media, in all due respect, I don't believe is making us be more polarized. We were already polarized. What social media does, just like any technology, is it gives us the ability to do more faster, to perhaps reach more people, but it doesn't necessarily fundamentally change who we are. And so I think that part of the challenge is that we don't focus on the fact that people are what's driving the behavior, and their desires are what's driving the behavior. And we often look for a scapegoat in the technology that says that the technology is doing something wrong or bad to us. And so I like to flip the conversation a bit to think about who we are as people, as individuals, and what are we doing that the technology is simply facilitating.
I would just add that I agree to a point, But when you're exposed to only certain points of view or things that you are told are facts day in and day out by your friends or people who you think are your friends, then that's because of the technology is making that possible. And
It's making that friend group larger.
right,
Right.
and also people who you don't think, who are not your friends, who are
But are
yeah,
connected to you in some way.
connected
Right.
to you, or
Right.
they're manipulating you, and
That's
that's
right.
because, and that's possible now.
That's
at scale,
possible.
at scale of
Right,
this, yeah.
I agree.
You know, I think that's a really interesting question. Does technology just make pre-existing trends more obvious, or does it create trends by itself? And one point in agreement and one point pushing back a little bit. After the 2016 election, I think liberals and Democrats, frankly, got totally paranoid about technology and Facebook so that they could blame the election of Donald Trump on technology and not on, you know, normal politics and their own policies. On the other hand, I do think there is some evidence that that technology, you know, that we've gotten. I think the political scientists are still going to be studying it, but it seems like we've gotten so polarized at just the same time as social media sort of took off, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of the way that if you're on Twitter all day, it can make you kind of go crazy in a certain way. So anyway, I don't know. I think that's a really
I just
interesting
wonder,
debate.
I mean, does it make you go crazier than if you were listening to a particular talk radio show or reading a particular newspaper? I mean, so I agree with you that it's an open question, but I just think that if we look at the evolution of technology and we think about it within that context, it becomes a question of, can we really blame social media and the technology, or is it human nature that is facilitated and scaled?
Okay. Have social media made speech more or less free around the world? Is it more free or less free? Free speech.
I think there's more free speech, as a result, especially in these other countries where they wouldn't have had ways in which they could communicate easily. So that's certainly done that. But what kind of free speech and what it's resulted in and is what we're talking about.
I agree.
You agree, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say if there's more or less free speech. I think the printing press probably made more free speech, but also, this gets back to the discussion we were just having, probably made religious warfare more intense as people could broadcast their religious ideas more widely. So I think, yeah, there's, like Sri says, there's a higher volume of free speech, but is it working the way it's supposed to is still up for debate.
Is it free speech if you can't live afterward? I mean, you know, there's discussion here about people dying because of saying the wrong things.
Yeah.
I mean, has social media, I don't know the details. I mean, I've read reports about these sorts of incitement in Myanmar and so on, and I don't, that's, you know, when the Tutsis were killing the Hutus, there was radio. You know, they were broadcasting incitement on the radio, so I don't think we really know. I think it's hard to say. I think it's really hard to say.
Does Silicon Valley's approach to speech is it affecting polarization, do you think?
Well, I think Silicon Valley is confused and doesn't know what to do. I think Jason outlined the problem, that they just believe that we have no responsibility. We're just a platform. Anybody can do whatever they want on there. We're not responsible for the comments. We're not responsible for what happens. But now they have learned that they have a responsibility. And I think they are stepping up in different ways and are showing some introspection. But we don't know, I don't think the answer settled it, whether they're going to be able to continue to do it and do it in the right way.
There was a question.
My microphone.
While we're waiting on the mic, no, the mic isn't here.
Okay.
I'll make it. How do you see historians or sociologists, say 50 years from now, looking back on this start of social media? How might they look at what's happened? could look ahead and then look back?
Well, I don't know. But I will tell you, I have studied the history of other technologies. And so when you look at the history books of other technologies, not necessarily just communication technologies, but even going back and looking at the electric light, one of the things that the historians of technologies will tell you is that the technology or the introduction of that technology did not fundamentally change human behavior. It facilitated what people already wanted to do. It gave them a broader stance, so if you look at what happened with automobiles or cars or whatever, it can say it allowed people to go further and talk longer or work longer, but it didn't fundamentally change their desires. It just facilitates. So if we look at social media in that context and think that it will follow that same pattern, then the historians will say the same thing. It didn't polarize us, but it allowed for greater polarization because it made networks larger. It allowed us to communicate with and find resources and to make that grow bigger. But whether or not it fundamentally changes behavior and what we do and how we feel, I don't know. We'll see.
I can just think that it's going to be, the discussion is going to be what this device did to all our brains. And it's going to be, I think, like we now look back at doctors would say that some doctors would say cigarette smoking was good for you and was kind of a healthy thing. And we'll look back at this period and understand that this was doing such damage to our brains and our lives and how we interact with each other and what we're doing. But it also did good things. So I think that finding that won't be as clear cut as cigarettes, but it'll certainly be a case of people seeing that there was a lot of damage done. Just on an optimistic side, if you saw the news this week of the climate change worries that are very stark and clear, if it turns out that there is a movement built through social that makes our government care and other people care about it, and something's done in these next 12 years, there's kind of some kind of point of no return, perhaps, then we'll say that this was worth it, all of this. But even if we're not able to build a movement and make something happen with that, is there anything more important than that issue? While we're all fighting about other things, the world is changing dramatically.
I would just really quickly on Jim's question about, I think that Silicon Valley is probably making polarization worse. Just sort of, there's a lot of distrust among conservatives that Silicon Valley is treating them fairly. I don't really think it's intentional. I just think it's similar to what happens on campuses when the college campuses try to make hate speech rules. That's necessarily going to ensnare conservative ideas more because one of those 10,000 Facebook editors is going to see a post saying we need to stop illegal immigration, and he says, well, is this racially hate speech, or an evangelical church Facebook page posts that marriage is between a man and a woman, that depending on the language used, it could get under the category of hate speech. And so there's a lot of anecdotal sort of evidence that has made people on the right distrust Silicon Valley more. And so in that sense, I think that it's going to be a problem for polarization.
But I'd also point out that during Justice Kavanaugh's hearing, one of the people sitting right behind him in support of him very prominently was Joel Kaplan, Facebook's vice president for global policy, public policy. He was sitting right there. So it's not true that Silicon Valley is all in one direction. You think that it is, but this is a perfect example of that kind of support. There are, of course, people in Silicon Valley who are very liberal-leaning, but libertarianism, I think, permeates in a way that most people may not be aware of.
Let me swing back from Silicon Valley to the other side of the country in Congress. There's been discussion about changing Section 230 of the Telecom Act, which would require Google, Facebook, and Twitter to take a far more active role in managing content. What do you think?
It's a difficult question. as to whether or not they should be responsible and what that level of responsibility is. But I think it's something that has to be revisited, at least to think critically about it, even if we just look at what I mentioned earlier, just the fact that many of the applications that we're using now are based on crowdsourced data. And so it fundamentally is shifting the way that technology is working. And so I think that it should be an open question as to whether or not the company should have more responsibility in policing, or at least being monitoring of some type the content that's communicated through their platforms. But I don't know where that line should be.
Sure.
Could you point out what Section 230 means to me? So Section 230 says that a conduit such as Facebook, etc., does not have any liability for the postings of
Users,
subscribers.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it means that if I were to libel somebody in a newspaper, the newspaper could be sued for libel by that person. But if I were to libel somebody on Twitter, then Twitter could not be sued for libel. Only I could personally be sued for libel, because Twitter is just a forum for the information. It's not a publisher of the information. And so that's where the debate about Silicon Valley monitoring hate speech comes in, because if it's really policing the speech and filtering it and saying you can't say this and bumping this up to the top of what you see, then isn't it basically a publisher? And then why shouldn't it be treated differently? Why should it be treated differently from a newspaper company? So it makes most sense to have this 230 protection, which is a very extraordinary protection for these companies from lawsuits if they really are just a forum. But the more that they start policing the speech, the louder the calls are going to be for them to be subject to ordinary legal accountability.
Good. Thanks for both your clarifications. We're coming to the end, and I'd like to ask a last question, the one posed as the subject of this panel. Are new media and social media good or bad for free speech? The correct answer is yes or no. No in between. You can explain why, but you have to first answer yes or no in 1 minute and 45 seconds for the three of you.
I'll start. I'll say yes, it is good, and I think that despite my lots of naysaying here, if I had to pick one, I'd say it's good, because I have hope, and I remain hopeful.
I am a professor at my core, and so I will never say yes or no. I will say it depends. I might object to the premise of the question. So it depends.
Good answer.
Jason.
Good answer.
I'll probably say, as of now, the answer is no. It's not good, because people are calling for censorship. The tech companies are implementing more and more codes of conduct that are becoming more elaborate, and people on the left want them to scrub fake news. So right now, I'd say the answer is no. I hope that someone asked about history. I hope that in hundreds of years it will be viewed as the printing press or the radio that created a lot of discord at the time. But in the long run, when we figured out how it fits into our society better, then the answer became yes.
Thank you. One question, last question that won't get answered is, does the First Amendment have to change because of technology? That came to me courtesy of my friend Robert Rosie Rosenthal. It may have to be addressed at some point later today. With that, thanks for indulging us. I hope there's been a little learning in this half hour of free speech.